right, Bill. Welcome, welcome,
Good to be with
welcome.
you. Hello.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for tuning in.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be with you, and greetings from the mountains of Vermont.
Indeed. So, Bill, you've got 200 people. You've been talking about climate change for a very long time. One of the leaders in this space. You've got 200 well-intentioned and reasonable people in the room listening to you. How do you see this movement right now in terms of gaining momentum and the position that we're at when it comes to actually taking real action on climate change?
Well, I have been thinking about this a long time. I wrote the first book about what we now call climate change, what we then called the greenhouse effect, back in 1989, so 35 or so years ago. And we're now at a completely interesting moment for a number of reasons. First one is scientists and engineers have done their job. They've dropped the price of renewable energy so sharply in the last decade that we now live on a planet where the cheapest way to generate power is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. That hasn't wholly sunk in yet I think in the population at large. We still talk about alternative energy as if sun and wind were the kind of whole foods of power, while coal and oil and gas were the Costco or the Sam's Club, but in fact, it's just the other way around. The only two things that keep the fossil fuel industry in business at this point are inertia and the toxic vested interests that they're able to exercise in our political system. So our job is to very, very quickly stop the combustion of things on the face of our planet. For 700,000 years, humans have been setting things on fire. It's served us pretty well. We learned how to cook food. We could move north and south from the equator. The anthropologists think that the bonds we formed around the campfire explain the social nature of our species. When we learned to control the combustion of coal and oil and gas in the Industrial Revolution, it produced modernity and everything we see around us. But now the costs are very high, much outweighing the benefits. The costs are, to enumerate the three biggest, the dramatic effect on human health of breathing the combustion byproducts of those fossil fuel. So we think now, new data from the last year, that it kills about one human being in 5 on this planet by filling their lungs with those particulates. Second cost is its deep connection to autocracy, exemplified this year by the fact that Vladimir Putin used his oil and gas earnings for his barbaric invasion of Ukraine. As long as we depend on resources that exist in just a few places, the people who control those places will end up with too much power, be they the King of Saudi Arabia or the Koch brothers or Vladimir Putin. And third, and of course largest, the existential threat represented by the climate crisis, a crisis that is gathering steam with every passing moment. We've seen the worst heat waves we've ever observed on this planet in the last 2 years across Canada and the Pacific Northwest, across China, across the Asian subcontinent. And those have happened during a La Nina period with a cool Pacific. That is switching. The forecast now is for an El Nino warm current by year's end. If it's a strong one, 2024 will not only set the record for the warmest temperatures we've ever observed. Jim Hansen, our greatest climatologist, has predicted we may well go temporarily past that 1.5 degree temperature mark with all the attendant horrors that will come. So our job is to very, very rapidly move away from the combustion of fossil fuels. And as I say, that's an entirely doable thing. The technology exists and on the shelf. Yes, I was listening to your movie. We're going to have fusion someday, perhaps, which will probably be great if we do. But it's not going to happen in the next few years, which is the relevant time frame for slowing down the rapid heating of the planet, what we have now on the shelf at affordable prices are solar panels, wind turbines, and the batteries to store their energy when the sun goes down or the wind drops. So most of our public policy should be devoted to rolling those things out at as rapid a pace as humanly possible. The IRA is beginning to do some of that work, and that's a good thing. But it also has to be accompanied by the quick ramping down of the fossil fuel industry. You'll see behind me the posters from last week's big action that we did in 102 cities across the country, shutting down as many branches of Chase and Citi and Wells Fargo and Bank of America as we could, because those 4 banks are also the 4 biggest lenders for the expansion, the ongoing expansion of the fossil fuel industry. This is an insane project that they're engaged in. And most of the companies in that room are engaged in it with them. New data this year demonstrates that for companies like Microsoft, their cash on hand is creating far more carbon than their operations, because it's being stored in those banks and lent out for new pipelines and frac wells and whatever else. So we need them taking leadership and pushing those financial institutions to stop their destructive course. We're going to find out in some level or another whether capitalism at this point is a kind of suicide pact or not, because that's what it looks like right now as we continue to fund the one thing that scientists tell us we simply cannot do any more of. So, in summation, an absolutely critical, fascinating crux moment, and really probably the last one of these crux moments we're going to get while we still have some freedom of action here.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is when you talk about solar, and certainly when you started covering this subject, the cost of solar power was very high. It didn't seem like it was going to be an option. But given time, given government incentives, given a tremendous amount of innovation, we got to the point where now solar power is a legitimate solution and is a viable option. Is that the same type of approach we should take to other energy resources? It's sort of a combination private and public effort?
Sure. I mean, and the IRA pours government money into lots of other things, green hydrogen and on and on and on. But none of that, I mean, remember, the key thing always to remember about climate change is it's a time-limited problem. Winning slowly on climate change is just a different way of losing. So the goal is got to be at this point to deploy that sun and wind that we do have and those batteries that we do have. We need to deploy them en masse immediately. And if we do, then 25 years from now, we may have fusion power, we may have green hydrogen, we may be able to do all kinds of interesting things. But if we don't do that now, then the drain of living on a planet that has lapsed into deep climate crisis is going to be so overwhelming and so expensive that those things won't be interesting or attractive anymore. They'll just be part of the wreckage.
I think if you'll notice, if we look at our program, one of the things I've noticed as we've been covering climate for the last year, is this is very much a business issue. There are a lot of businesses in the room here. There are a lot of CSOs that have taken new roles. You know, the whole role of the CSO didn't exist 10 years ago in Fortune 500 companies. And now most Fortune 500 companies not only have a CSO, but they have an entire sustainability initiative. They are working on metrics. We're going to hear a lot about that today. I mean, have you seen a change in how businesses see this issue? Are they treating it differently? And do you get is there any optimism, any reason for hope there?
Yeah, I mean, look, there are businesses that are starting to take it really seriously. I wrote a piece for the New Yorker this year that, for instance, talked about the remarkable work that companies like Microsoft or Meta or Google or whatever have begun to do to try and wring carbon out of their supply chains. And it really was fascinating. And in a long talk with the people at Google, they were making cell phones And they were worried that the aluminum was carbon intensive. And so they hired huge teams of metallurgists and chemists and things to figure out how to work with their suppliers to reduce the carbon intensity of the, beveled aluminum screen around their phone, and God love them. But the point of the piece was that they hadn't taken the even more obvious and far, far, far more important step of going and talking to their bankers and saying, stand up to the fossil fuel industry, stop lending them money for expansion. And this was orders of magnitude larger amounts of carbon that Google was pouring into the atmosphere. When you factored it in, their carbon emissions went up 111%. Microsoft's much the same, and on and on and on. So I don't think we've yet reached the point where businesses are willing to do the thing we really need them to do, which is rock the boat here, stand up on political, stand up to the real big political or financial powers. I've often talked with chief sustainability officers and had them explain to me that, all the good things they're doing with their fleets of delivery trucks, say. And I always say, thank you very much, but the thing we really need is your fleet of lobbyists. We need them no longer trying to hack out one more small tax break for you out of Washington. We need you standing behind the people who are trying to really change the way we take on the world.
Yeah, I think you mentioned the IRA. I think that's one of the things that's given a lot of people hope that this is, and we're going to hear more about it this afternoon, it's a substantial investment in a whole host of new technologies. This is coming from a government that I think many of us have felt has been deeply broken for a very long time. How do you find the IRA encouraging? It did not go far enough, and how big a victory is it?
Well, it's a mixed victory. I had a long talk earlier this week, interviewed John Podesta for a piece for the New Yorker, who's overseeing the implementation of the IRA for the administration. I mean, look, let's give credit where it's due and blame where it's due. The reason we have an IRA is because climate activists, especially the young people in the Sunrise Movement, put forward this demand for a Green New Deal, and it found large political traction. And that became the Build Back Better bill once it had been shrunk a lot by the Biden administration. And then when it got to Congress, who took it on but Joe Manchin of West Virginia, who's taken more money from the fossil fuel industry than anybody else in DC. Not an easy title to win, but he won it. And he earned his money by gutting all the enforcement mechanisms that were originally in that bill. Now it's nothing but carrots, mostly in the form of tax credits. And yet it's still the first substantial thing that Congress has done. It took 34 years and 40 days after Jim Hansen first testified before Congress to get any kind of bill. But the bill does have perhaps enough money in those tax credits to substantially jumpstart the deployment of a lot of this technology, of solar panels and wind turbines, but also of electric vehicles, of induction cooktops, and of heat pumps in basements, the holy trinity of household appliances that we need to quickly spread out. Whether or not it can do it fast enough is a real question. And of course, one part of the pound of flesh that Manchin extracted was an ongoing insistence that the federal government continue to lease land for oil drilling. And so we saw just last week, the Biden administration go ahead and allow the development of a brand new oil project in Alaska, the Willow Project for ConocoPhillips, a project so absurd that they're literally going to have to employ huge chilling machines to refreeze the permafrost that they've already melted so they can drill for more oil in order to raise the temperature of the planet additionally. So it's as good as we got. We're going to have to make as best use of it as we can. It's not easy. because there are 140 million homes in America and many, many million businesses, and each one of them needs to have a lot of machines pulled out and replaced. That's hard work to make happen fast, and fast is the key here. And let's just reiterate why we have to go so fast. I mean, we now know from great investigative reporting exactly how the fossil fuel industry stood up this campaign of deceit and denial and disinformation 30 years ago. And that cost us the thing that we most needed. It cost us time. So now we have to, as that video you showed earlier pointed out, cram this work into 5 or 6 or 7 years instead of 30 or 40 years. I don't know whether it's possible. We're going to continue to need as much shoving as we can. The IRA is a decent shove. It's only in one country, and it's a beginning, but nowhere near an end.
Yeah, maybe talk a little bit about that. This is a crisis that faces the entire planet, and we're talking about a U.S. solution, and the IRA is obviously a U.S.-based bill. But the consequences and the effects are being felt across the globe, and it raises equity questions about countries that have not had the opportunity to industrialize as quickly as the United States. Now we're going to them and asking them to slow down. Can you just talk a little bit about how you see this playing out on a global scale?
So the good news here is, yes, your analysis is correct. There's a deeper equity question than that, too. I mean, the people who have contributed the least to this problem are the ones who are dying from it first and foremost all over the world. In terms of industrialization, I mean, the good news is that with the rapid fall in the price of renewable energy, countries like India, which is probably the next really important country making its way up the energy curve, could conceivably be the first to accomplish most of its industrialization without the heavy use of fossil fuel. It's ideally positioned to take advantage of sun and wind and to do it very cheaply. At the moment, the cost of building a new solar farm in India is less than the cost simply of operating an existing coal-fired power plant in India. On the other hand, India has a big coal lobby. Modi ran for president, flying on the private jet of the biggest coal baron in India, the Adani company. And so it's not going as fast as it could or should. And we should be doing everything we can to help spur that along. It's one of the reasons why we're so insistent on taking on these banks. Look, Citi, Chase, Wells Fargo, Bank of America are American banks, but they are global players. The 4 biggest lenders to the fossil fuel industry in the world. And if they announced, as HSBC did in December, that they're no longer going to lend for the expansion of the hydrocarbon industry, that would send a huge signal out around the world. That's why we need the companies in that room putting pressure on their bankers to act responsibly going forward.
So we're pretty close to time, although my confidence monitor is not working. So maybe I got all day to talk to you. But what is the takeaway for this audience? What would you ask people to do other than just don't stop banking at those banks?
Well, I mean, look, we've got to figure out how to pull the levers large enough to matter. The scale of the climate crisis is the largest thing that humans have ever done, and there's nothing else that even comes close. And so the levers that are big enough to pull that matter are few in number. One of them is market politics. We've pulled that hard, and we're going to have to keep pulling it as best we can. A lot of the action's moving to the state level now, and so it's going to be really important to do the best we can in state capitals across the country and city halls. The other lever is market finance, and it's not just the banks, it's the asset managers and the insurance industry that provide the money and the underwriting that the fossil fuel industry needs to survive. We're not even demanding that people cut off all their financial relationships with the fossil fuel industry. Sadly, we're going to be using oil and gas a few years longer, so they need banks. We're just demanding that they stop the expansion of that industry. And that's the key thing here. And it's not a radical demand made by crazy environmentalists. It comes straight from the scientific community and from the International Energy Agency, set up by that crazy radical Henry Kissinger in the 1970s as the club of oil consuming nations, said in 2021 that if we wanted to meet any of these targets we've set, that financing for the expansion of the fossil fuel industry needed to stop that year, 2021. That's what we need. We need people pushing hard and seriously. And I know that it's uncomfortable, and I know that it would be much easier if we could just let this play out naturally over time. And over time, it will work. 30, 40, 50 years from now, we're going to run the planet on sun and wind, if not fusion, because it's cheap. But if it takes us 20 or 30 years to get there, then the planet we run on sun and wind will be a broken planet. Our job is to make it happen fast.
Is there, what's the role, obviously you've been an activist for many years and have been pushing for change from that platform. Have you seen the role of activism shift over time as it seems like it's much more of an issue for young people than it has been for older people. But I feel like there's a generational shift that we're seeing, and there's a lot of energy there. And I think that's actually where as you mentioned, that's where the Green New Deal started.
Well, the Green New Deal came from young people, and most of the climate movements come from young people, and you know about most of them. The Sunrise Movement and Greta Thunberg and her great allies around the planet, and these are amazing people. The development of the last year that's been really fun and that I've gotten to play a hand in is that older people are now systematically backing them up. We started Third Act a year ago, and it's grown like topsy because people over the age of 60 understand that their legacy is now on the line in a way that really no generation's legacy has ever been. And that's who was outside the banks last week at these 102 locations across the country. In fact, if you go read the stories in the Times or the Post or NPR or things, you'll see many of them focusing on the thousands of people who turned out in Washington, D.C., old people who closed down the banks with lines and lines of rocking chairs. We were all sitting down and rocking in front of Chase and Citi and so on, so that they had to shut for the day. That was a symbolic reminder that the same generation who brought us the first Earth Day in 1970 has reawoken to the problems that we face. So hopefully, some combination of old people and young people will be enough to get the planet off its butt and ready to work. And if you look at I was very glad that you played the words of Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN at the beginning of this, because as I wrote recently, he really has come to exemplify the powerful reaction of people who have been able to escape vested interest. Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, is objectively the closest thing we have to a leader of the whole world. And he has been talking in exactly the same terms that I have or that Greta has for the last couple of years. A couple of weeks ago, he said of the fossil fuel industry, your core product is our core problem. That couldn't be stated more straightforwardly. So I think that the division at this point of the world into activists and others is probably a mistake. There were headlines after the Biden administration approved this giant oil project in Alaska that says, Biden upsets environmentalists, as if people who cared about the climate were some kind of special interest group. We're not. The only special interest group here is the fossil fuel industry, who are determined to keep their business model of setting things on fire alive as long as they can. Happily, the good Lord hung a large ball of burning gas 93 million miles up in the sky, and we now know how to make full use of it, we're going to be graded. Our final exam is whether we do indeed make full use of it in the time that we still have.
Excellent. Well, Bill, thanks so much for joining us today. We're going to leave it there. I hope you stay tuned in for the rest of the stream because we're going to address these issues all day long.
Fantastic. Many thanks.
Thanks so much, Bill.